The wind came first, carrying sand that bit at exposed skin like tiny teeth, and then came the sound of hooves pounding against the hard-pan desert floor. Sister Maria del Carmen stood at the narrow window of the adobe mission, her fingers gripping the rough wooden frame as she watched two riders emerge from the dust storm, like ghosts taking solid form. The taller one rode with his body hunched forward, favoring his left side, while the other kept glancing behind them as if the devil himself gave chase. She should have turned away. She should have bolted the door and pretended she heard nothing over the howling wind. But something in the way the injured man swayed in his saddle made her think of her own father, years ago, coming home from a fight he never should have picked. Before she could think better of it, Maria found herself at the heavy wooden door, pulling it open against the force of the storm. The two men nearly fell from their horses. Up close, she could see the blood darkening the taller one's shirt, the exhaustion etched into both their faces like carvings in stone. The shorter of the two, with hair the color of late summer wheat, met her eyes with an expression somewhere between hope and disbelief. "Sister," he said, his voice rough from dust and desperation, "we don't mean any trouble. My friend here, he's been shot. We just need somewhere to rest until the storm passes." The injured man lifted his head, and Maria felt something shift in her chest. His eyes were the color of a winter sky, pale gray and startling against his sun-darkened skin. A scar ran from his temple to his jaw, but it was the look in those eyes that caught her, a weariness that went deeper than any physical wound. "Come inside," she heard herself say, stepping back to let them enter. "Quickly, before you're seen." They stumbled through the doorway, bringing the smell of leather, sweat and blood into her small sanctuary. The wheat-haired one helped his companion to the bench near the fire, while Maria secured the door against the storm. Her heart hammered against her ribs in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the sudden awareness that she was utterly alone with two strange men, and that 6 months of solitude had made her forget how it felt to have another living soul close enough to touch. She moved to the injured man first, her hands steady despite the trembling she felt inside. "I need to see the wound," she said, reaching for the buttons of his shirt. His hand caught hers, gentle but firm. "Ma'am, you don't have to do this." "I'm a healer," Maria said quietly, meeting those grey eyes again. "It's what I do. And unless you want to bleed out on my floor, you'll let me work." The corner of his mouth twitched, almost a smile. He released her hand and let her unbutton his shirt, revealing a lean, scarred torso and a bullet wound that had torn through the muscle just below his ribs. The wheat-haired man moved closer, his presence warm at her shoulder. "I'm Jesse," he said softly. "Jesse Morrow, and that's Caleb Stone. We're grateful for your help, sister." She didn't look at him, focused on cleaning Caleb's wound with water from the pitcher by the fire. "Maria," she said. "Just Maria, and you can tell me later why someone's shooting at you." Jesse laughed, a sound that was surprisingly light despite their circumstances. "That might take all night." The storm raged outside while Maria worked, her fingers moving with practiced efficiency as she cleaned, treated, and bandaged Caleb's wound. She was acutely aware of the rise and fall of his breathing, the heat of his skin beneath her touch, the way his muscles tensed when she pressed too hard. She was aware, too, of Jesse watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, something between admiration and curiosity. When she finished, she stepped back and found her hands shaking. 6 months. 6 months since she'd touched another person beyond the occasional hand placed on a fevered forehead or a child's scraped knee. 6 months since Father Miguel had died and left her alone in this mission, trying to serve people who didn't entirely trust her, trying to fill a role she'd never been meant for. "This stew," she said, her voice rougher than she intended. "It's not much, but you're welcome to it." Caleb's eyes followed her as she moved to the fire. "Thank you, Sister Maria." "Just Maria," she repeated, ladling stew into wooden bowls. "I'm not actually a nun. I never took final vows." She didn't know why she told them that. Perhaps because the way they looked at her made her want them to know she wasn't entirely bound by the cloth she wore. Perhaps because the loneliness of the past 6 months had worn her defenses thin as paper. Jesse accepted his bowl with a smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Well, just Maria. You might have just saved Caleb's life. That counts for something in our book." They ate in silence, broken only by the wind's howl and the crackle of the fire. Maria found herself studying them when she thought they weren't looking. Caleb ate slowly, methodically, like a man who'd learned not to waste anything. Jesse ate with more enthusiasm, occasionally glancing at her with that warm, easy smile that made something flutter low in her belly. "If you were this woman, living alone for years, would you let 2 strangers step into your home on a night like this?" The question hung in the air between them, unspoken, but present nonetheless. When the bowls were empty, Jesse helped her clean up, while Caleb sat still, clearly fighting the pull of exhaustion. The simple domesticity of the moment felt strange and right, all at once. Jesse's shoulder brushing hers as they worked side by side, the quiet rhythm of ordinary tasks shared. "We should leave in the morning," Caleb said finally, his voice low and rough, "before we bring trouble to your door." Maria turned to face him. What kind of trouble? Jesse and Caleb exchanged a look, and in that silent communication, she saw years of friendship, of shared hardship. It was Jesse who finally spoke. "There's a man named Clayton Garrett. He owns half the territory, or thinks he does. He's been trying to push the Apache off their land, and we didn't take kindly to watching him burn out families and murder elders. So you stood against him," Maria said quietly. Caleb's grey eyes held hers. Someone had to. She understood then, with a clarity that surprised her. These weren't outlaws or drifters looking for easy shelter. They were men who'd chosen a hard path because it was the right one, who'd put themselves between the powerful and the powerless. Men not unlike her father had been, before the world broke him. "The storm won't clear before morning," she said. "You can stay until then, but you should know that if Garrett's men come here, I won't lie for you." "We wouldn't ask you to," Caleb said. But Jesse smiled at her with that warmth that seemed to reach inside her chest and kindle something long dormant. "We wouldn't dream of compromising your principles, Maria. Though I have to say, any man who'd threaten a woman like you doesn't deserve the protection of truth." She felt heat rise to her cheeks and turned away, busying herself with banking the fire. "There's a room in the back. It's small, but there are blankets. You should rest." She expected them to go, to leave her alone with the strange tumult of feelings they'd stirred up, but Caleb remained where he was, his gaze steady on her face. "You live out here alone?" he asked. "For 6 months now, since Father Miguel passed. That's a long time to be by yourself." It was the simplest statement, but something in his voice made her throat tighten. Nobody had acknowledged it before. The weight of that solitude, the particular burden of being a woman alone in a place where loneliness could break a person as surely as any physical hardship. "I manage," she said softly. "I'm sure you do." He stood slowly, favoring his injured side. But managing isn't the same as living. The word stayed with her long after both men had retired to the back room, long after the storm had begun to quiet outside. She lay on her narrow cot near the fire, listening to the sounds of their breathing in the next room, acutely aware of their presence in a way that made sleep impossible. It had been 6 months since she'd had relations with anyone beyond the most basic human contact. 6 months since she'd felt the warmth of another body near hers, since she'd known the comfort of not being utterly alone. And before that, years, stretching back to a time when she'd been someone else entirely. A young woman who'd loved and lost and chosen this path as a way to escape the pain of living. But lying there in the darkness, listening to the quiet murmur of Jesse's voice and Caleb's low response through the thin wall, Maria felt something uncurl inside her chest. Something that felt dangerously like hope, like possibility, like the first green shoots of spring pushing through frozen ground. She didn't sleep that night. She lay awake and felt her body remember what it meant to want, to yearn, to hunger for something more than just survival. And when the dawn finally came, pale and clean after the storm, she knew that whatever happened next, she had already crossed some invisible threshold from which there was no returning. The morning light found the three of them in the small kitchen, Maria preparing breakfast, while Jesse helped, and Caleb watched from the doorway, his color already better than it had been the night before. There was an ease to their movements together, as if they'd known each other far longer than a single storm-tossed night. "You cook like my mother used to," Jesse said, watching her flip tortillas on the griddle. "She always said food tastes better when it's made with care." Maria glanced at him, catching the shadow of old grief in his eyes. "You miss her every day." He smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes this time. "She died when I was 16. Cholera took half the town that year." She wanted to reach out, to touch his hand in comfort, but she kept her fingers busy with the food instead. "I'm sorry. It was a long time ago." Jesse moved closer, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. "But you never really stop missing the people who loved you, do you?" The question hung between them, weighted with meaning. Maria thought of her own losses, the man she'd loved who died before they could marry, the children she'd never have, the life she'd chosen in the wake of heartbreak. "No," she said quietly. "You don't." Caleb's voice cut through the moment, gentle but firm. "We should talk about what happens next." They gathered around the small table, the food between them. Outside, the desert was waking up, birds calling to each other in the cool morning air. Inside, the three of them sat close together, knees almost touching in the cramped space. "Garrett's men will be looking for us," Caleb said, his eyes on Maria. "If they come here, you need to be able to honestly say you haven't seen us." "But they saw us ride this way," Jesse added. "They'll search every building within 10 miles. Maria set down her coffee, her mind working through the problem. "There's a cave about 2 miles north, hidden in the rocks. The Apache children showed it to me. If you stay there during the day and only come back at night, no one would know." "We can't ask you to risk that," Caleb said. She met his grey gaze steadily. "You're not asking, I'm offering." Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding that went deeper than words. Jesse reached out and covered her hand with his touch warm and solid and utterly disarming. "Why would you do this for us?" he asked softly. "You don't know us." Maria looked down at his hand on hers, at the contrast of his sun-browned skin against her paler fingers. "Maybe I'm tired of playing it safe," she said. "Maybe I'm tired of just managing instead of living." She felt Caleb's gaze on her, intense and searching. When she looked up, she found him studying her with an expression that made her breath catch. It wasn't just gratitude in his eyes, or even respect. It was something warmer, something that made her skin flush with heat. "All right," he said finally, "we'll stay, but on one condition." "What's that?" "You let us help you, with the mission, with whatever needs doing. Fair exchange." It was the last thing she'd expected. Most men would have simply taken the offered help and disappeared into the desert. But Caleb Stone wasn't most men, and the quiet dignity in his offer made something ache in her chest. "Fair exchange," she agreed. And so began a pattern that would shape the days to come. Caleb and Jesse would disappear before dawn, taking refuge in the cave, while Maria went about her daily work at the mission. She taught the Apache children, tended the small garden, and tried not to think too hard about the 2 men hiding in the rocks, waiting for darkness. But when the sun set and the desert cooled, they would return. Jesse always came first, slipping through the door with that easy smile, often bringing firewood or wild herbs he'd found during the day. Then Caleb would arrive, moving more carefully, still healing, but growing stronger each night. They would eat together, the 3 of them crowded around the small table. Jesse would tell stories that made Maria laugh, tales of his travels and the colorful characters he'd encountered. Caleb would listen mostly, but when he did speak, his words carried weight, observations about the world that showed a thoughtful mind behind those watchful eyes. And slowly, carefully, they learned each other. Maria discovered that Caleb had been a scout during the war. that he'd seen things that still haunted his sleep. She learned that Jesse had been a gambler before he met Caleb, that the two of them had saved each other's lives more times than they could count. She learned the way Caleb's mouth would soften when he looked at her, the way Jesse's eyes would light up when she smiled. They learned her too, learned about the man she'd loved and lost, about her decision to join the mission after his death, about the slow realization that she'd been running from life rather than toward God. They learned that she was stronger than she looked, fiercer than her gentle manner suggested, capable of a kind of courage that had nothing to do with violence and everything to do with choosing to keep going when it would be easier to give up. On the fifth night, as they sat together after the meal, Jessie reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. The gesture was so tender, so intimate, that Maria froze, her breath catching in her throat. "You have beautiful hair," he said softly, "like burnished copper in the firelight." She should have pulled away, should have reminded him of the cloth she still wore, of the vows she'd technically never taken but had lived by nonetheless. Instead, she found herself leaning into his touch, her eyes drifting closed for just a moment. When she opened them again, she found Caleb watching them with an expression that made her heart race. There was no jealousy in his gaze, no disapproval, just a quiet intensity that spoke of his own carefully controlled desire. "I should check your wound," she said to Caleb, needing something to do with her hands, some excuse for the way her body had begun to hum with awareness. He stood and moved to the bench by the fire, unbuttoning his shirt with slow, deliberate movements. Maria forced herself to focus on the task at hand, unwrapping the bandage with steady fingers. The wound was healing well, the edges clean and already beginning to knit together. But as she leaned close to examine it, she became acutely aware of Caleb's breathing, of the rise and fall of his chest, of the way his skin warmed beneath her touch. Her fingers lingered perhaps a moment too long, and when she looked up, she found him watching her with those grey eyes that seemed to see straight through all her carefully constructed defenses. "Maria," he said, his voice low and rough. Just her name, nothing more, but the way he said it made her feel like the most precious thing in the world. Jessie moved to stand behind her, close enough that she could feel the heat of him along her back. "We should tell you," he said quietly. "We're not just partners. We're brothers in every way that matters, and we share everything." The implication hung in the air between them, heavy with promise and possibility. Maria's hands trembled as she finished rebandaging Caleb's wound, her mind racing with the implications of what Jessie had just said. "I don't understand," she whispered, though part of her did understand, perfectly and completely. Caleb reached up and caught her hand, pressing her palm flat against his chest where she could feel the steady thrum of his heartbeat. "We're both drawn to you," he said simply. "Both of us. And we won't force you to choose between us, because that's not how we work." "We've loved the same woman before," Jesse added, his breath warm against her ear, "and we would never ask more than you're willing to give. But if you want us, Maria, you can have both of us. Completely. Utterly. For as long as you'll have us." She should have been scandalized, should have pushed them away and reminded them of propriety and morality and all the rules she'd lived by for so long. But standing there between them, Caleb's hand holding hers against his heart and Jesse's presence solid and warm at her back, Maria felt something break open inside her chest. "I haven't been with anyone since Thomas died," she said, the confession spilling out before she could stop it. "That was 8 years ago. I don't even know if I remember how." Jesse's arms came around her waist from behind, gentle and sure. "We'll remember together," he murmured against her hair. "There's no rush, Maria. We have all the time in the world." But even as he said it, they all knew it wasn't true. Garrett's men were still out there, still searching. This borrowed time they'd carved out together existed in a fragile bubble that could burst at any moment. The awareness of their mortality, of the precariousness of their situation, made every moment more precious, more intense. Caleb stood slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. "We want you," he said, his voice rough with honesty. "Both of us want you more than we've wanted anything in a long time, but this only happens if you want it too, if you want us." Maria looked between them, these two men who had crashed into her solitary existence like a storm, who had reminded her what it meant to feel, to want, to live. Jesse with his warm eyes and easy smile, his gentle hands and quick laughter. Caleb with his quiet strength and watchful gaze, his scars and his careful words. "I do," she whispered. "I want this. I want you." The kiss, when it came, was soft and slow and devastating. Caleb's mouth found hers first, his lips gentle against hers, giving her time to pull away if she chose. But Maria didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned in, her hands coming up to frame his scarred face, kissing him back with 8 years of pent-up longing. Jesse's hands moved to her waist, his lips finding the side of her neck, placing soft kisses along the sensitive skin there. Maria gasped against Caleb's mouth, overwhelmed by the sensation of being touched by both of them at once, of being the center of their combined attention. They moved slowly, carefully, giving her time to adjust to each new sensation. Caleb's hands in her hair, loosening it from its tight bun until it spilled over her shoulders. Jesse's fingers at the buttons of her simple dress, each one opened with deliberate care. The rough calluses of their hands against her skin as they touched her with a reverence that made tears sting behind her closed eyelids. She had forgotten this, the weight and warmth of another body pressed against hers. The slide of skin on skin, the breathless anticipation of each new touch. They undressed her by firelight, their eyes dark with desire, but their hands infinitely gentle, as if she were something precious and breakable. When she stood before them in nothing but the glow of the flames, Maria felt no shame, only a bone-deep rightness. Caleb traced the curve of her hip with his fingertips, his touch feather-light, while Jesse pressed kisses to her shoulder, her collarbone, the hollow of her throat. "Beautiful," Jesse murmured against her skin. "You're so beautiful, Maria." They laid her down on blankets by the fire, their bodies bracketing hers, surrounding her with warmth and safety and want. Caleb kissed her again, deeper this time, while Jesse's hands explored the curves of her body with patient thoroughness. She arched into their touches, her breath coming faster, her body remembering what her mind had tried to forget. They took their time, learning her responses, discovering what made her gasp and sigh and moan. Caleb's mouth found her breast, while Jesse's fingers traced patterns on her inner thigh, never rushing, never pushing for more than she was ready to give. The pleasure built slowly, a tide rising inside her, washing away years of loneliness and grief and self-imposed isolation. When she finally shattered beneath their hands and mouths, crying out their names in the firelit darkness, it felt like coming home to a place she'd never known existed. They held her through the aftershocks, their hands soothing now, their voices murmuring soft words of praise and tenderness. Later, much later, when they'd all found their release and lay tangled together in the blankets, Maria felt tears sliding down her temples into her hair. Jesse brushed them away with gentle fingers. "Are you all right?" he asked softly. "More than all right," she whispered. I'd forgotten what this felt like, being close to someone, being wanted." Caleb pulled her tighter against his chest, his breath warm against the top of her head. "You're wanted," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Make no mistake about that, Maria. You're wanted and cherished and needed." She fell asleep there between them, safer and more content than she'd been in years, perhaps in her entire life. The fire burned low, casting dancing shadows on the adobe walls, while outside the desert night stretched vast and starlit and full of possibility. But possibility has a way of colliding with reality, and reality came thundering up to the mission 3 days later in the form of a dozen armed men led by Clayton Garrett himself. Maria was teaching the Apache children when she heard the horses. Her stomach dropped like a stone, but she kept her voice steady as she told the children to go home, to run quickly and tell their parents to stay inside. They scattered like birds, vanishing into the desert with the speed of long practice. She was standing alone in the doorway when Garrett and his men rode up, a wall of horseflesh and weaponry and barely contained violence. Garrett himself was a big man, broad-shouldered and red-faced, with the kind of eyes that looked through people rather than at them. "Sister," he said, his voice carrying the false friendliness of a man used to getting his way. "We're looking for 2 fugitives, dangerous men. They came this way during the storm a few nights back." Maria clasped her hands together to keep them from shaking. "I haven't seen anyone," she said, making her voice as calm and steady as possible. "The storm was fierce. I stayed inside and prayed." Garrett's eyes narrowed. "You mind if we search the place? Just to be sure." It wasn't really a question. Maria stepped aside and let them tear through her small mission, trying not to flinch as they overturned her meager possessions, kicked through the garden she'd tended so carefully, scattered the children's learning materials across the floor. They found nothing, of course. Caleb and Jesse were hidden in the cave, as always, waiting for darkness. When the men finally mounted up to leave, Garrett paused, his horse dancing beneath him. "Those men are killers," he said, his voice hard. "If you're hiding them, you're aiding criminals. I'd hate to see anything happen to a woman of God." The threat was clear. Maria lifted her chin and met his eyes. "I'm not hiding anyone," she said, "and I trust in God to protect me from those who would do harm." After they rode away, she stood in the wreckage of her mission and shook like a leaf in a high wind. But she didn't cry. Instead, she began to clean up, putting things right with methodical determination, preparing for the night when Caleb and Jesse would return, and she would have to tell them what had happened. They arrived separately as always, Jesse first, with his easy smile that faded when he saw her face, then Caleb, his eyes immediately scanning the room, taking in the signs of the search. "They came," he said flatly. Maria nodded, sinking onto the bench by the fire. Garrett himself. They searched everywhere. Caleb and Jesse exchanged one of their silent looks. Then Caleb knelt in front of her, taking her hands in his. "We have to leave," he said gently. "Tonight, before they come back." "No." The word came out fiercer than she'd intended. "You're not healed enough yet, and they'll be watching the roads." "She's right," Jesse said, moving to stand behind her, his hands coming to rest on her shoulders. "We'd never make it out of the territory. Not with Garrett's men everywhere." "Then what do you suggest?" Caleb asked, his eyes still on Maria's face. She took a deep breath, the plan forming even as she spoke. "We fight back. Not with guns, but with the truth. Garrett's been stealing Apache land, murdering their people. If we could get word to the territorial governor, bring in federal marshals." "That would take weeks," Jesse said, "and Garrett would know what we were doing long before any help arrived." "Not if we're careful." Maria's mind was racing now, pieces falling into place. "There's a trading post 3 days' ride from here. They have a telegraph. If one of you could make it there, send a message to the governor, we might have a chance." Caleb shook his head. "I'm not leaving you alone with Garrett's men circling." "Then I'll go," Jesse said. "I'm faster and Caleb's still healing. He can stay here with Maria, keep her safe." It was the only solution that made sense, but the thought of Jesse riding out alone into danger made Maria's chest constrict with fear. She turned to look up at him, memorizing the warm brown of his eyes, the gentle curve of his mouth. "Be careful," she whispered. Jesse bent and kissed her, slow and deep and full of promise. "I'll come back to you," he said against her lips. "Both of you. I swear it." He left before dawn, slipping away into the pre-morning darkness like a shadow. Maria stood at the window with Caleb's arm around her waist, watching until Jesse disappeared into the vast emptiness of the desert. Then she turned into Caleb's chest, and finally let herself cry. He held her without speaking, his hand moving in slow circles on her back, his presence solid and grounding. When her tears finally stopped, He tilted her face up to his and kissed her forehead, her cheeks, the tip of her nose. "He'll make it," Caleb said quietly. "Jesse's smart and quick. He'll get through." "And then what?" Maria asked. "Even if he reaches the trading post, even if the governor sends help, how long do we have to hold out?" "As long as it takes." Caleb's grey eyes were steady on hers. "We'll figure it out, Maria. Together." The days that followed were among the longest of Maria's life. Caleb stayed hidden during daylight hours, but now he hid in the mission itself, in a small storage room that could be concealed behind a sliding panel. Maria went about her routine, teaching the children, tending her garden, trying to act as if nothing had changed. But at night, when the desert cooled and the stars came out in their millions, Caleb would emerge from his hiding place, and they would sit together by the fire, talking or simply existing in companionable silence. Sometimes he would read to her from the worn books in Father Miguel's small collection, his voice deep and soothing. Sometimes she would sing the old hymns she'd learned as a child, and he would listen with his eyes closed, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. And sometimes, when the loneliness became too heavy to bear, they would reach for each other in the darkness, their bodies finding comfort and connection and a desperate kind of hope. Caleb made love to her with a thoroughness that left her breathless, his hands and mouth worshipping every inch of her skin, his voice murmuring her name like a prayer. In those moments, Maria felt more alive than she had in years. She felt seen, cherished, wanted in a way that went beyond mere physical desire. Caleb looked at her as if she were the answer to a question he'd been asking his whole life, as if she were something precious and rare and worth fighting for. "I never thought I'd find this," he told her one night, his fingers tracing idle patterns on her bare shoulder. "After the war, after everything I'd seen and done, I thought I was too broken for love." Maria turned in his arms, pressing her palm against his scarred cheek. "You're not broken," she said fiercely. "You're healing. We both are." He kissed her then, deep and slow, and she felt the truth of her words settle into her bones. They were healing each other, these damaged souls who'd found each other against all odds. But healing takes time, and time was running out. On the 8th day after Jesse's departure, Apache scouts brought word that Garrett's men were gathering in the nearby town. They were planning something, the scouts said, their voices tight with concern. Something big. Maria and Caleb sat together that night, the weight of the news pressing down on them like a physical thing. The fire burned low, casting long shadows across the adobe walls. "If they come in force," Caleb said quietly, "I can't fight them all off alone. Not without risking you getting caught in the crossfire." "Then we don't fight," Maria said. "We run. There's another mission 2 days north. We could make it there, warn them about Garrett." Caleb looked at her for a long moment, his grey eyes unreadable in the firelight. "That would mean leaving everything you've built here. The children, the mission, all of it." "It's just a building," Maria said, though her throat tightened as she said it. "The children have their families. They'll be all right, but you and Jesse are trying to stop a man who's killing innocent people. That matters more than one adobe mission in the middle of nowhere." He pulled her close, pressing his face into her hair. "You matter," he said roughly. "You matter more than you know." They made love that night, with an urgency born of uncertainty, their bodies seeking reassurance in the oldest language humans know. Caleb moved inside her with a desperation that matched her own, both of them trying to burn this moment into memory, to hold on to each other against whatever was coming. Afterward, as they lay tangled together in the blankets, Maria whispered the truth she'd been holding back. "I love you, both of you. I know it's impossible. I know it's not what I planned, but I do." Caleb's arms tightened around her. "Nothing's impossible," he said. "And love is never something to apologize for." They fell asleep in each other's arms, and Maria dreamed of a future where the three of them could be together openly, without fear or hiding, a future that seemed as distant and unreachable as the stars. She woke to the sound of hoofbeats. Caleb was already moving, pulling on his clothes with swift efficiency, checking his guns. Outside, the sky was just beginning to lighten, the desert waking up in shades of purple and rose. The hoofbeats grew louder, closer. Maria dressed quickly, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was it then, the moment they'd been dreading. Garrett had come back, and this time he wouldn't be satisfied with just searching the mission. But when the rider appeared in the doorway, it wasn't Garrett or his men. It was Jesse, covered in dust and sweat and grinning like a madman. "Miss me?" he said, and then Maria was in his arms, laughing and crying at the same time. Caleb was there a moment later, gripping Jesse's shoulder, his usual reserve cracking to show the relief underneath. Jesse hugged them both, his voice rough as he spoke. "I made it to the telegraph. Sent messages to the territorial governor, the federal marshal's office, even a friend who writes for a newspaper back east. Help's coming, but it might take a week or more." "Garrett's planning something," Caleb said. "The Apache scouts say his men are gathering." Jesse's expression sobered. "Then we don't have a week. We have to move now, get you both somewhere safe." They spent the rest of the day preparing, gathering supplies, making plans. The Apache women came quietly, bringing food and blankets, pressing small tokens into Maria's hands and whispering blessings in their own language. The children hugged her goodbye with tears in their eyes, and Maria felt her heart break a little, leaving them behind. But as the sun began to set and she stood between Caleb and Jesse, their horses packed and ready, Maria felt something else too. Hope, purpose. The sense that she was finally moving towards something instead of running away. They rode north as darkness fell, 3 shadows moving across the desert under a sky full of stars. Behind them, smoke began to rise from the direction of the mission. Garrett's men burning what they couldn't steal. Ahead of them, the path was uncertain, dangerous, fraught with risk. But Maria rode between Caleb and Jesse, and she was not afraid. They traveled for 3 days, moving carefully, avoiding the main trails. At night, they made camp in hidden arroyos and rocky outcroppings, building small fires that wouldn't be seen from a distance. And in the privacy of those camps, the 3 of them came together with a fierce joy, celebrating their survival, their connection, their unlikely love. Jesse would make them laugh with his stories, his hands gentle as he braided Maria's hair or tended the horses. Caleb would stand watch, his presence solid and reassuring. And when his turn to sleep came, he would hold Maria close and whisper things he'd never say in daylight. On the 4th day, they met the federal marshals riding south. A whole company of them, grim-faced men with badges and authority. The lead marshal listened to their story, his expression growing darker with each detail. "Garrett's been on our list for a while," he said, "but we needed proof, witnesses willing to testify. You 3 just gave us what we need." They rode back south together, the marshals and their unlikely trio of witnesses. When they reached the burned-out mission, Maria stood among the ruins of what had been her home for 2 years and felt nothing but relief that she'd left when she had. The Apache were there, gathered and waiting. They told their stories to the marshals, bearing witness to Garrett's crimes. And when the marshals finally arrested Clayton Garrett 3 days later, it was with enough evidence to ensure he'd never trouble anyone again. In the weeks that followed, as the legal proceedings ground forward and the territory began to heal, Maria found herself at a crossroads. The church hierarchy wanted to send her to a new mission, far from Arizona and the scandal of having traveled alone with 2 men. But Maria had other plans. She stood before the territorial bishop in his office in Santa Fe, her hands folded calmly in front of her, and formally renounced her association with the church. She had never taken final vows, she reminded him. She was free to go. "This is about those men," the bishop said, disapproval heavy in his voice. "This is about me," Maria corrected gently, "about choosing to live instead of hide, about accepting love instead of running from it." She walked out of that office and into the bright New Mexico sunshine, where Caleb and Jesse were waiting with the horses. They'd bought a small ranch in the foothills, a place with good water and enough land to build a life, a place where three people who loved each other could make a home without judgment or fear. Jesse helped her mount, his smile warm as summer. Caleb rode close beside her, his hand reaching out to twine his fingers with hers. And as they rode toward their future together, Maria felt something she hadn't felt in longer than she could remember. Peace, joy, the bone-deep certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The desert stretched out around them, vast and beautiful and full of promise. Somewhere behind them, the church bells were ringing, calling the faithful to evening prayer. But Maria didn't look back. She kept her eyes forward, on the horizon where the sun was painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, on the two men who rode beside her, on the life they would build together. She had been alone for so long, managing instead of living, surviving instead of thriving. But those days were behind her now. Ahead lay something richer, fuller, more complicated and messy and absolutely perfect than anything she could have planned. Ahead lay love, in all its wild and unexpected glory. And Maria rode toward it with her head held high and her heart wide open, ready for whatever came next.